So this is for Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Specifically, very, very specifically, it's important to mention that this is only the 1855 version. 1855. Now, why is that important? Well, because the way Whitman did Leaves of Grass is that Leaves of Grass eventually became like his lifelong project, in which instead of just being this one poetry book that only has I think it has 7 poems in it, instead of just being this one thing, it grew and became like his life's work. So if you go and you pick up a copy of Leaves and Grass, for the most part, it's gonna be like that thick, because it's like every single thing that he wrote in his lifetime, which is just monstrous. But this 1855 version, the most important poem that comes from this is Song of Myself, right? I feel bad doing this one because I get that, as an English major and English teacher, I'm supposed to love Whitman, but I just don't get it, and I don't enjoy it, and I don't enjoy reading it. And that's hard to admit because I'm supposed to like him. Walt Whitman is, I want to say Walt Whitman is the most translated and the most sold American poet in the entire world, and I just don't get it. And that's really the big thing here, is that I just don't see it in the way that everyone else seems to. And part of that could just be because I don't like this guru personality that Whitman ends up putting on in his later years, where he intentionally forms himself to be this kind of soothsayer personality and this guru personality. And I just don't, there's something that rubs me the wrong way about that, and I think that has put itself into my reading of his poems, is that he wants to think of himself as much bigger than just a person. He wants to be a prophet, and he styled himself in that way. However, if we take that out and we just look at the original version of Leaves and Grass, it's incredibly impressive. There is really strong correlations to what we would consider Eastern religions, in connections and in the idea that we are all part of the same consciousness, which is actually just really fascinating to read, especially in this kind of format. Yeah. There's also some other interesting arguments in here, right? There's Whitman's entire argument against slavery, right? And I agree with this, is that he basically compares it to sight, in which he argues that if you have the right to see things, does that mean that someone else has the right to be blind? Which then gets into a whole other argument of disability and things like that. But at a base level, it's arguing if you have the right to do something, does that equate that then someone has the right to not be able to do it? And that's really his, I think his best summed up piece in this, and it's against slavery, which is fantastic. This book was read as part of the American literature class. That's American literature leading up to the Civil War. So this was published a couple years after Moby Dick. Yeah. Really, I guess the only other thing of note that I can think of to speak positively on is the way that this book is written is really Walt Whitman trying to put himself into the everyman personality, which he was not. At this point in time, he was a fairly well-known New York journalist at this point, I believe, and he used those connections that he had to get this book published in the first place. But in the way that he wrote this, he only mentions his own name twice, right? There's the first time in which it's like published by Walter Whitman, which you go, the big stuck-up guy. But then, and I don't know if this is any in the other publications of the book, but then instead of giving an author, it just gives us this picture, right? This is the way that the original one was printed. It was produced and whatever by Walter Whitman. I believe at the end it said Walter Whitman, but introduction to an author, there's no name. It's just Leaves of Grass, and then this lovely photo, right? And that is a photo of Walt Whitman, but he's an everyman, right? And he styles himself as an everyman. The only other mention of his name is actually in Song of Myself, which is really which he refers to himself as Walt Whitman, which is like the idea of being the everyman, which is just a fun, interesting thing, right? I guess the other positive note would be like this is the birth of free verse poetry, which really stands as to like the form of America. When you think of American poetry, you think of free verse poetry. And this Leaves of Grass is really the birth of it. And it was created by Walt Whitman to be the poetry of America, right? He felt that America needed a style that was like appropriate to the culture of America, but also was just significantly different from the rest of the world, because he felt that America was just not, you couldn't compare it to any other country, because America had only existed for 70 years at this point, right? And it was a process that for a lot of people thought it was failing, right? And to this day, I think it's failing. No comment on that, but it's a really a thought experiment being put into play, and Whitman tried to create and then created really the voice of what American literature is. I talk about Moby Dick, like I think Moby Dick is like the American Odyssey, right? It is, if you're going to point at a book and say what is the American book, I would probably point to Moby Dick, because I think it does the same thing that free verse does, right? Where it wanders and it talks about a lot of different things, and it doesn't conform to any one significant piece. But if you're going to ask an international, what is the American voice, they would probably point to Walt Whitman and Leaves of Grass. On the negative side of things, like I said, I just don't connect with Whitman's writing personally. I don't like how it's structured. You know, the 1300 line poem to begin throws you off a little bit. And, you know, I get why it's done that way, or at least I think I understand why it's done that way, but that's just not... He has made everything else in a way that puts himself as the everyman, but then his poetry is anything but, right? Or the style in which he produces poetry is anything but. I also struggle with the constant writing into perspectives and ideas that he doesn't really have an idea of. And I don't know how much work was put into this, right? Of where, like, you know, you're trying to find and you're working with people who experience like their lives this way, right? And I feel like he just doesn't do that, or he tries to write from so many different perspectives, and he just doesn't quite get it, I don't think. Yeah. It's one of those weird things where I just don't connect with what he is trying to do as a poet, which is fair enough. With that being said, I would give this probably a 5. I love poetry. However, I think this is just... I just don't connect with it in the way that I should, or the way that I expect to. And maybe those expectations are making this a much lower grade than it should be. But yeah, right. If importance-wise, in American literature, this is probably the most important piece of literature in any period of time, right? This is probably number 1. But I just can't. Like, I would never envision myself ever reading this ever again for any reason. I would currently, right now, if I was asked to write a paper about this or reread this again in 2 years or so, I would absolutely not read it, and I would just go from memory, and I would take the L on it. I really would, because I don't think I could ever read this again. But on to the shelf it goes anyway. C'est la vie. Let's see. Note for me going into this, it is currently, like, I think it's April 20th right now. You're going into camp soon, which means that you're gonna have to figure out how to record and upload from camp with barely any internet. You also figure out what in the world you're gonna read. Because as much as I want to, I don't think I can really read some of these books at a camp meant for elementary and middle school kids. C'est la vie.